Social Mobility Pledge, Sam Tarry, who's Labour MP for Ilford South and Shadow Minister for Transport, and Professor Ellis Cashmore, Professor of Sociology at Aston University and a renowned author. They're here to answer your questions. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put your question through right now. And of course you can text us on 84850. And don't forget, you can watch us on Global Player.
0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's go to our first question. It's from Alex in Watford. Hello, Alex.
Yes, good evening. I've
Hi.
cried several times this week. Does the panel agree the Prime Minister has got to resign to stop any further suffering on 155,000 families in this country?
Justine Greening. You're muted, Justine.
I don't think I am, actually.
No, well,
I don't know if anyone else
you're not now. Okay, carry on.
Great. Evening, Ian. Thanks for having me on the show. I think it is indefensible what happened, and certainly the Prime Minister seems to have attempted to make an apology at Prime Minister's questions, but it does seem to me that for a lot of people that won't have been enough, and a lot of Conservative MPs will be considering whether they should be adding their voices to those others who are saying he should resign. From my perspective, I think that what will actually happen is, first of all, it seems to me, watching PMQs today, I don't know what Sam felt being in the chamber of the House of Commons. I don't think the Prime Minister is going to resign. And I think the most likely outcome is that we are going to have to wait for the Sue Gray report to come out. We'll see what that has. And then it will be up to not just Conservative MPs, but I think the wider public to have their say when we get to the May elections. But it does feel to me like this remains a moving feast. And it feels like if Number 10 had hoped that PMQs would almost draw a line under where things are today, then possibly that's not actually proving to be the case, as we see more Conservative MPs coming out saying they think he should resign. So I think it's a very difficult position that the Prime Minister finds himself in, and understandably so, given what's now come to light. And I didn't lose any relatives to COVID during the last 18 months, but I did lose my grandma, and it was incredibly hard to get into hospital to see her. It was hard to hold her hand because of the COVID risks, and only one of us was allowed at a time. And I think I hadn't had a chance to see her hardly in the last year of her life. And I think for many, many people, in fact, almost everyone around this country that has had their family life and life with friends profoundly affected by what's happened with COVID, I think the least we expected was for those setting the rules to be able to follow them themselves.
If you were still a Conservative MP, would you be sending a letter to Sir Graham Brady asking for a vote of confidence in Boris Johnson?
Well, I'm not a Conservative MP.
I know.
But I think it's inevitable that MPs will be looking at their casework that's coming in and what their constituents think about all of this. They'll be getting a sense from being in the tea rooms about the broader feeling within the Conservative parliamentary party. And I think they will be trying to work out what they think is the right thing to do. And I think for the public, maybe it'll be May when we find out how they look at what's happened in the round. It certainly feels very raw tonight for lots of people. I think it'll be interesting to see when we get to May, potentially, how they stack up this against, frankly, the priorities they want to see this government delivering on around things I care about, like levelling up, for example. So it's one of the things I'm sure that the wider public will be looking at.
Yes, but
it remains to be seen how many people will have thought this is it now, having seen what's happened over the last 72 hours.
You are part of the wider public now. As you said, you're not an MP, so I don't understand why you're ducking the question. Do you think he should resign or not? Do you think there should be a vote of confidence?
I think there may well be one, but as for my own personal view, I think many people will feel this has now gone too far for the Prime Minister. I also recognise...
What do you think?
I think if I was in the House of Commons, I'd be having those discussions, no doubt, with colleagues to see what the general consensus is. I also think Britain remains in a very difficult situation with COVID and the Omicron variant. I don't think anybody really wants to have a change of leader at this stage unless it's absolutely unavoidable. And those are very important decisions that need to be taken. But part of that is also about whether the parliamentary party now can actually remain confident in Boris Johnson. And that is about the wider team that I used to be part of, but I'm not part of now, Iain. And they collectively have to reach a decision on this. I agree that there's a wider question for those of us in the broader public about our own views, but ultimately this is about whether we can have a cohesive team in the parliamentary party able to continue to be a party in government backing the person who's Prime Minister.
Sam Tarry, we had your neighbour was streeting on earlier, saying, well, actually, it may be in the Labour Party's best interest for Boris Johnson to stay, but the Labour Party is more interested in the national interest. The national interest is that he should go. Were you in the Commons at lunchtime today to watch Prime Minister's questions and the statement that he made, and what did you make of it?
Yeah, I squeezed in. I mean, it was the busiest it had been. And interestingly, just a few days before, when he'd sent out one of his other ministers as the kind of fall guy, to sort of just repeatedly say the same thing about waiting for Sue Gray's report, it was much more busy on the Conservative side. But I'd have to say, I mean, look, I've been MP since 2019. That was the most gloomy and the most stony-faced I've seen Conservative MP since, I've been elected. No doubt about it. And certainly on our side of the House, I think that people could smell blood. I think, look, I mean, in all seriousness, listening to his speech, reflecting on it, listening to it again later this afternoon on some of the news clips, it was clearly very lawyered up, like he must have really planned what he was going to say quite precisely, because I think he still wants to duck out of this. I think he's just hoping that there's enough on a kind of almost a technical let-off that he can get away with it. I think that's really problematic because the general public won't give a monkeys, frankly, about whether technically he's breached the rules, because clearly the spirit of the rules has been clearly broken. I'm getting sent memes by friends of mine who don't care about politics, pictures of, the Prime Minister mocked up partying in different places. People are just not only on one hand incredibly hurt, but also laughing at the Prime Minister. And I think this is the thing, it's cut through, and it's cut through really deeply. People are angry. There are so many people out there that have lost a loved one. I mean, I think it wasn't that long ago, the Prime Minister himself, on the day of May 2020, I think the Prime Minister in a comment that day had actually announced about 181 NHS workers that had actually died that day, and over 130 social care workers. So that's the context in which people are seeing this. It was only a few weeks ago the Prime Minister was saying, there's nothing to see here. There wasn't a party. It's taken several weeks to even admit till today that he was actually there, and not only there, but there with his wife. And other people have already said today that she was also there drinking. This was clearly something which was a party. And I think it's not good enough to just say, I've just rocked up out of my office and there were people there and they've all been very hardworking. I'm sure that they were. But the fact is, across Britain, people were working from home, people were abiding by the rules. And do we not think for 1 second that people thought it was fine to get together with dozens and dozens of work colleagues and have a few drinks, that they would have been doing that in their gardens? And actually, most people weren't. And certainly employers weren't going to be doing that at that time. And so this is the thing. Whatever happens, he's already lost support of the British people. I think, look, there is a good question about whether, the Conservative Party decide to let him stagger on, for a few more months, while they decide at what point to wield the knife to get rid of him, whenever it's Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak or whoever they decide to put forward, in that internal election. They're not completely daft. They know that there are some really difficult things coming up. Tax rises that are going to be hitting us pretty soon. At the same time as the energy crisis, no one's going to want to come in as the new Prime Minister right away.
Do you think, though, that even though probably everyone can agree, even the Prime Minister agrees that he's acted wrongly, he has apologised, do you think that a Prime Minister should lose their job over something of this magnitude? That's what quite a few people, well, I say quite a few, I've seen on social media some people saying that this is ridiculous, that in the wider scheme of things, that this is not a big issue. It doesn't compare with a Prime Minister going to war in Iraq under false pretences, allegedly, or we could go back in all Prime Ministers to think of various things that they've done and got wrong and they haven't lost their jobs over. Is this of that magnitude?
Sure, and look, Tony Blair ordered knighthood and over 1 million people immediately signed a petition saying they thought that was terrible. I mean, look, I think the thing with this is it's not just a one-off. It's a series of different things that have happened over the last 18 months, whether it was Barnard Castle, which actually happened not long after the 20th of May, whether it's the contracts that have now today in the High Court's been decided have been completely corruptly awarded the VIP access to get, certain companies and certain cronies of the government contracts for, up to £3.5 billion in totality awarded to friends of theirs. This is the thing. It's not just a one-off. It's the building up of lie after lie after lie over a period of time when actually, so many British people have done what they were asked. They've done their duty as the Prime Minister stood and actually said himself. They followed his instructions. And yet again, he's not done the same as what so many of almost the rest of us have done.
Professor Ellis Cashmore, you haven't got a political axe to grind in this, at least I don't think you have.
None at all.
What do you make of what you've heard today? I mean, we've all sort of witnessed political events over the last 20 or 30 years where sometimes you often think, oh my God, that's that politician finished, they're going to have to resign. Then somehow they come through it. What do you think is going to happen after today?
I think he'll tough it out. I think he will be cancelled about resigning, and then he will listen to several pieces of advice and then make up his own mind, as he always does, and just say, the hell with it, I'm going to tough this out. And part of me will be thankful for that. The other part will not be. The part that won't be thankful is the part of me that likes someone in charge who has an intellect and a capability for leadership. The part that will enjoy a continuation of Johnson's prime ministerial tenure is the part that enjoys a spectacularly popular and entertaining Prime Minister, because he is, after all, very entertaining in the same way that Donald Trump was. Useless politician, but tremendous showman. And that's the part that I'll miss of Johnson when he eventually goes. Look, this is the way I understand Johnson and have understood him, I think, for several years. This is a guy that sort of flipped and flopped through life and dropped on a mayoral position in London and thought, I'm extremely popular. I can do gigs on TV. People love me for it. I'm the most popular politician in the country. I'm going to have a crack at the big job. And he did so and walked in. It was easy, so he thought. He negotiated the Brexit deal, at least in part, and got it, as he called it, oven ready. Thought, well, if I get into the hot seat, all I've got to do is dot the I's and cross the lowercase J's, and I'll have the Brexit done, and people will worship me for it. And so he thought, what I'll do is get in the hot seat for 5 years, do my one tenure, and then sign a book deal, probably get 8 or 9 million quid for advance royalties, then go on one of these nice lucrative lecture tours, as Theresa May is doing at the moment, and have a nice cushy long retirement. And of course, then COVID happened. And he found himself plunged into a nightmare, not of his own making, and completely unlike a nightmare that had been faced by any other politician in British history. And he didn't know what to do. And, let's face it, not many politicians would know what to do. So he then started to take advice. I think he probably rejected a lot of it, but he took some of it and muddled his way through. Not always adeptly, often maladroitly, but he did manage to muddle his way through. And in the process, we know that he was exposed as a liar, and sometimes those lies were white lies, but otherwise they were grosser. But we forgave him because we were all in this mess together. And we thought, who else can lead us out of this? Well, eventually he's done exactly that. At least, we're not at an end, but an end is in sight. And Johnson will take some credit for it. And I think that credit is in the bank for him. He's still an immensely popular guy, despite all his weaknesses, his foibles, and his error-strewn life. He's still popular somehow. And that's because he isn't a proper politician. He's more of a showman, as I said earlier. Well, so I think, this is a very long-winded way around of answering your question, Ian, but my guess is that he will tough this out and try and endure for another 24 or so months and then find an escape route towards the start of the next general election.
Well, the one thing I'm going to take from that is you think he's going to get an advance of £8 or £9 million for his memoirs, because he and I share a publisher. I'm going to get my agent onto that because I think I'm being underrated.
I go by the amounts that politicians in the US get Hillary Clinton.
I don't think he'd be getting
million.
Quite that much.
And there, biographies by politicians are, they are.
Well, they can sell, not all of them do.
Extremely big sellers, remember. And I think that there's a lot of interest in Johnson. There will be a lot of interest in his memoirs.
Alex in Watford, thank you very much for your question. Lots more to come. It's 17 minutes past 8.
Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 20 past 8 on LBC. Justine Greening, former Cabinet Minister, Sam Tarry, Labour's shadow transport spokesman, and Professor Ellis Cashmore from Aston University. They're all here to take your calls. Let's go to Anthony in Manchester, who's a first-time caller. Hello, Anthony.
Hi, mate. How are you?
Hi, very well, thank you. What would you like to ask?
Okay. I just wanted to ask the panel, if the public had been prosecuted and fined up to £10,000 for COVID breaches, number one, if found guilty, would the Prime Minister and party attendees be prosecuted too? And number two, if he is found guilty, will the members of the public who were prosecuted and convicted and fined have their prosecutions and convictions overturned for being guilty of essentially the same offence as Boris Johnson?
Sam Tarry.
Look, people that committed a crime should pay the price. Unfortunately, I had people in my constituency in Ilford who were fined £10,000 at a massive house party, and we would literally couldn't dig the graves fast enough to get people into in Ilford, I'm afraid. And so on that basis, it is only fair, and I agree with your call on this, that the Prime Minister should face a full police inquiry. If rules are broken and other people are being prosecuted for the same breaches of rules, they should absolutely not just be about resignation, but about prosecution. And I have to say as well, Downing Street is one of the most heavily guarded places in the entire United Kingdom. What have the police, who were clearly there on that day, got to say about what was going on? I think the Met Police do actually at this point need to be looking at themselves, because clearly they were fully aware of what was going on. At the same time, as your caller rightly points out, other people were being prosecuted.
The police have got a problem, though, haven't they? Because they've said they wouldn't investigate the previous party allegation back in December. So if they now say they're going to investigate this, surely they then have to go back and investigate that one too. That is a bit of an issue for them, surely, Sam.
Yeah, I think it is an issue, actually. I think there's some real issues at the Met Police at the moment. They haven't exactly had a good sort of 18 months, and I think that there are some real questions to be asked. Look, nobody in this country, from the Prime Minister to anybody else, is above the law. I think this is what this comes down to. It cannot continue to be. This is what's made people so angry. It just feels like we've taken the PISS out of the British electorate so badly. That's why people are so angry. And so if some people are being prosecuted, surely if the Prime Minister is guilty of committing a crime or breaking those regulations, he does need to face the full force of the law. Because at the moment, what's making people so angry is the double standards. One rule for them, one rule for the elite, a different one for everyone else.
Ellis Cashmore.
I'm not so sure I agree with Sam. I'm not sure that everybody is angry about this. I obviously, I've been following the news over the past 24, 48 hours. So, I've listened to people, and yes, some of them who are directly affected and who have lost loved ones, I include myself, by the way, are quite properly aggrieved. But this guy's a rubber ball quality, remember, and he does tend to bounce back, and his popularity may not be affected in the long term. Should he be prosecuted? I was having this conversation with a friend of mine early on today, and I said, well, the police would have been stationed outside Downing Street, so they probably didn't know what was going on in the garden. But he pointed out to me, he said, well, there are police at the back as well. He said there's a whole cordon, so it would have been happening before their eyes. So there were several officers who were witnesses. So I'm sure it would be quite easy to bring a prosecution. But I'm mindful of what you've said, Iain, and I pointed this out to him, that the police have said they have no interest in pursuing a prosecution. I'm guessing what they would say at this stage is it in the public interest?
Well, I think the public would respond and say undoubtedly yes.
Is probably not.
Well, the public, I think, given the calls that we've had on LBC over the past 2 or 3 days, I think the public would shout a very loud yes, that it is in the public interest. They would think it was in their interest. Justine Greening, what do you think?
I certainly think that there would be at the moment. Okay. It's a question how you define how the public itself defines its interest and how the police service defines its interest.
Okay, Justine.
And they'd say that there's got to be a lot of expenditure.
Ellis, we have to move on. Justine.
Okay, sure.
It may well be that Sue Gray herself recommends that this is something that the Met Police need to look at. I do think that if it's so clear that there's a reasonable possibility an offence has been committed, then they would have to look at it. You can't have crimes not investigated because of who might have committed them. And I think that's the big risk for the Prime Minister in all of this, is that actually, whilst the Met Police maybe on previous occasions thought, we're not sure we want to end up in the middle of a political debate about following rules, on this occasion and in this case, and maybe at the end of Sue Gray's report, actually, the reality is they don't really have that choice. And it is quite clear that she thinks it is something that the Met Police should investigate. And they certainly shouldn't not investigate because of, if you like, where this crime might have emanated from. I think there were lots of people prosecuted in relation to breaking rules, and therefore this shouldn't be particularly drawn back from because of the fact that it was at number 10 Downing Street. I think there is a clear discussion around the public interest and the fact that actually the police do need to be clear-cut about investigating things wherever they happen, by contrast. But it may well be that actually Sue Gray herself forces it down this route. Because I think the reality is, and I know Sue because of the time I spent in government, she's a complete professional and she will do her work. But I also feel that she might think that this is something in a sense that really needs to be looked at by the police, and she can only take it so far. Who knows?
Okay. One
of the challenges with the Prime Minister's statement, I think, at PMQs today is that it doesn't really put this to bed, and therefore we are now, as he said he wants to, and has proposed, waiting for Sue Gray to finish her report. Now, that could take quite some time. You know, who knows what might still come out over the next few days that might then have to feed into Sue Gray's inquiry. So I don't think it's great that we are left in this like limbo land of waiting to see what Sue Gray will come out with, and it could well end up with a police investigation.
Anthony, let's come back to you. What's your view? What do you think should happen? Should there be prosecutions? Do you think? I mean, it would be a bit impractical to refund people's fines, wouldn't it?
Well, I've got a couple of points on that. I have a friend who last year sadly lost his auntie, and the family, you know, there were family and friends who turned up at his house just to pay their respects, and they were all outside in the back garden, and the police turned up and broke up this impromptu gathering of about 20 to 25 people, and warned them severely about gathering with all the COVID restrictions going on. On another point, if I was ever to be brought to court for a similar breach, I would just plead the same defence as Boris Johnson if he gets away with it. And what could the court say? Because I'll just turn around and say, well, I didn't actually realise it was a party. I turned up and I said hi to everybody, and then I left when I realised what it was. Where does it end? Can you see where this would lead to, and how people would react if the situation came about in the future, and that is what they were facing? And then think about people who held their hands up when they were in breach of COVID lockdown rules and said, all right, it's a fair cop and I'll pay my fine and accept my punishment. How will they feel if Boris Johnson manages to slither his way out of this one?
Do you think he will?
Yeah. Knowing Boris Johnson, what I know of him, it didn't surprise me that when it looked like Donald Trump wasn't going to be successful with his challenges for the US elections, that Boris Johnson was one of the first major prime ministers to throw him under the bus. Boris Johnson is a yard dog. Yeah, he will fight and he will scrap to save himself. He doesn't care less who he has to trample across and hurt in that process. That being the case, yeah, Boris Johnson really doesn't care about anybody or anything. It's all about him. Always has been. Okay. It is now, and it always will be. But that's what the UK signed up for. There's an old saying that a country gets the government it deserves. I wonder how those people in the red wall of the north feel today.
All right, Anthony, thank you very much indeed. Well, I just need to bring you a little bit of news now, because we finally heard from the Chancellor of the Exchequer, because he's been very... Well, he hasn't been silent. He's been on a visit in North Devon today.
Very nice ice cream in Ilford, right? 200 miles away.
Very nice. Ilford is a great place. He says in a tweet, I've been on a visit all day today, continuing work on our plan for jobs, as well as meeting MPs to discuss the energy situation. The PM was right to apologise, and I support his request for patience while Sue Gray carries out her inquiry. Well, we'll have more of your calls in just a second. 0345 6060 973. Let's get the news headlines at 8:30 with Lottie Morley.
Conversation, cross-question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It's 8:34 on LBC. With me on the panel tonight, Justine Greening, former Conservative Cabinet Minister, founder of the Social Mobility Pledge. Sam Tarry is Labour MP for Ilford South. He and I should both be at the football tonight, shouldn't we? But we sacrifice ourselves, don't we, Sam, for the benefit of the LBC
the struggle
listener.
Takes many forms, Ian.
It really does. He's also Shadow Transport Minister. And Professor Ellis Cashmore is Professor of Sociology at Aston University. And he's... Now, have you got a book out at the moment, Ellis, that you've been paid £8 or £9 million for?
Not quite that much, but, I'm a hard negotiator, as you know.
I know.
I've got a book on Michael Jackson coming out in May.
Michael Jackson?
Mm-hmm.
That's a surprise.
Well, I like interesting characters who deserve a slightly different analysis than regular biographers.
Well, we'll
that's what I try to do.
I'll have you back. In fact, I'll have you on my book club podcast to talk about that. Right, let's go to our next caller. It's Shaq in Wood Green. Hello, Shaq.
Hello, how are you?
I'm all right, thank you. What would you like to say?
Yeah, it's about Jacob Rees-Mogg, what he said about Douglas Ross. Now, I too think exactly the same as Douglas Ross, and many thousands of people of this country think the same. Does that make me also a significant person and thousands of others?
Well, let me just remind listeners, if you weren't listening in the last hour, I interviewed I interviewed Jacob Rees-Mogg, and I asked him about the fact that Douglas Ross, who's the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, had said that he thinks Boris Johnson should go. Now, I thought that was quite a big thing for the Scottish Tory leader to say. Let's just hear what Jacob Rees-Mogg said.
People do sometimes vote for people in leadership elections who don't live up to expectations, but I don't think Douglas Ross is a big figure. I think Alistair Jack is a really serious and senior figure.
But you see, that almost illustrates why Douglas Ross has said this, because to say that the leader of the Scottish Conservatives is not a big figure in the Conservative Party...
He's been constantly in opposition to the Prime Minister. He opposed Brexit. He is not somebody who you would ever expect to say helpful things about the Prime Minister.
Well, that clip has, shall we say, gone viral, certainly on Twitter at the moment. Scotland is in uproar. What do you make of this, Ellis? Is it one of these political gaffes that is going to live long in the memory?
Well, that's the first time I've heard it, Ian, and it struck me, almost a breathtaking gaffe, really. A brother of the same party, and he dismisses him as insignificant, yet this is a man who does hold a senior position, the most senior position in Scotland. It is almost unbelievable that but it shows this, I suppose, just reflecting on it for a moment, it shows this kind of imperiousness that Rees-Mogg seems to have about him, as if, he's there by divine right, he's a Tory, but not a Tory like the new Tories. It's almost like the bourgeoisie used to dismiss, the traditional money, the landed gentry, used to dismiss the bourgeoisie as new money. And Rees-Mogg seems to be saying here, I'm a real Tory, I'm an old Conservative, and these Johnny-come-latelys who are now just emerging as Tories really don't deserve the same kind of respect or worship even as us old schoolers.
Justine Greening, ever since you've been involved in politics, the Conservatives have had a, shall we say, tempestuous relationship north of the border. Not long ago, they had no seats whatsoever. Ruth Davidson revived the Scottish Conservative Party. She's now in the House of Lords, but she has also come out in Douglas Ross's support today, as have the majority of Scottish Conservative MSPs. I mean, this is going to go down like a cup of cold sick in the Scottish newspapers tomorrow, isn't it?
Sure it will, and I think the Prime Minister actually needs to think about who he is sending out to do his media on this, because actually if all they do is cause more problems and stir up more resentment and anger, then it's hugely counterproductive. I also, though, think there's a broader issue now for the Conservative Party about the fact that parties that are divided lose elections, parties that are united win elections. I'm somebody who won a marginal seat in London. That took a lot of hard work, but actually you need united teams if you're going to be able to win elections. And so I think it doesn't help the Conservative Party to have these very public arguments, and especially about an issue that's so important. And I think there's a way of having these disagreements that isn't about, frankly, making personal attacks on someone for having a different point of view. And I think you can argue, if you're a Conservative, that Douglas Ross should have been making his points and Ruth Davidson should have been making those points behind closed doors. They might be in opposition in Holyrood, but they're not in opposition in Westminster, and that's something they need to remember. But actually, having done that, I don't think that Jacob Rees-Mogg has done anything other than probably made a bad situation worse. And if he thinks that saying that is going to bring Douglas Ross and those Scottish Conservatives more on board, then, of course, it's done the exact opposite. So I think there'll be a lot of Conservative MPs who are hugely frustrated right now with how they are seeing this debate being played out in public by their own side.
On the other hand, Justine, if I may interrupt, it may convince a lot of people that there are Tories around who tell the truth. And he obviously was telling the truth, even though it was a gaffe of the first order.
Well, my point is,
Go on.
Sorry, go on. My point is that Douglas, whether or not you agree with his views, the point is that Jacob Rees-Mogg did not deal with the fact that he disagreed with them. And I think to call those views insignificant, given the nature of what we're all talking about and how important it is, I don't think that's a sensible way for cabinet ministers to approach debating this issue with
It's what he believes.
It's what Douglas believes, and it's what Jacob believes. I'm saying I think it's harmful to the Conservative Party to see. I'm saying I think it's harmful to the Conservative Party to see that, as it were, dirty washing being washed in public.
Yeah, but the public like it when politicians do speak their mind, which Boris Johnson manifestly doesn't. So they may value the honesty of Rees-Mogg in calling out a colleague and dismissing him as insignificant.
But you see, that's an interesting comment in itself, because you said Boris Johnson doesn't speak his mind. The reason he became popular was because he did speak his mind.
He did, and that's why people loved him to begin with. But progressively, over the past few years, since he's been in the prime ministerial role, he seems to be, not seems to be, we have documented evidence that he does cover up a lot and he speaks with forked tongue a lot of the time. So it might be refreshing for a lot of the members of the public, the electorate, to listen to Rees-Mogg.
Sam Tarry, would you like to intrude on the Conservative Party's private grief?
No, look, I mean, I think I actually am worried about this because it has far bigger consequences than just an internal spat between the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party and Rees-Mogg. Because for me, Rees-Mogg embodies everything that's wrong with the Conservative Party. People in Scotland will listen to someone like him and think, wow, we want to vote to get the hell out of Britain as soon as possible. And this is the problem. Johnson himself has really presided over what is quite an English nationalist party. And so for people like Douglas Murray, he'll be extremely worried that this is just going to be banging another nail into the coffin.
I think you mean Douglas Ross, not Douglas Murray. You get your Douglases mixed up.
Yeah, too many sort of right wings. But it's a serious point. The union has been under threat for a long period of time. At the end of the day, look, I respect whatever the Scottish people decide, but I'd rather they didn't leave, quite frankly. I'd rather, keep Britain together. And so every time something like this happens, when, someone like Rees-Mogg, who sort of archetypically embodies this kind of completely out of touch, almost aristocratic kind of character from the 18th century, people in Scotland are thinking, hold on, we didn't vote for these guys. We voted for them in very small numbers, and yet they are still ruling our country. And this is the problem. That's why Douglas is so angry about this, because he sees the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is these sorts of things are going to end up splitting up our country.
And we all remember what happened in the 18th century in Scotland, don't we? Lots of rebellions. Right, we'll come to more of your calls in just a moment. Nick from Rubery has texted to say, I don't want to ask a question. I like cross-question. Yeah, but if everybody took your view, Nick, we wouldn't have a programme, or I'd have to ask all the questions myself. I need a bit of help, Nick. 0345 6060 973. It's coming up to 8...
With Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:47 on LBC. Justine Greening, Sam Tarry and Professor Ellis Cashmore with us taking your calls. Sophia, you called me tomato, I don't know. Sophia, I'm going to go with, in Fulham. What would you like to ask?
Hi, so I am currently someone who's canvassing for the Conservatives locally, and I'm curious what the panel thinks the impact of Boris's performance today will have on the local elections in May. I would also be curious about what the members of the panel will be telling people at the doorstep if they were door knocking in the upcoming days. So I get the feeling that I know what Sam would be saying. He'd probably be telling them to vote Labour.
Well, before I go to the panel, what's been your experience? Are you getting a bit of hostility at the moment?
Well, I've made the executive decision that I'm not going to go door knocking this week because I'm not keen on getting the door slammed in my face. But I personally believe that if things don't change, Boris is becoming a liability, and not only to the National Party, but also to the party on a local level, which is largely unfair because I really genuinely believe that areas benefit from having Conservative local councillors. And I'm not looking forward to confronting angry voters because, if I'm honest, I can't really defend the government at the moment with any sort of conviction.
OK. Sam, let's come to you first on that. You probably go door knocking every week, I imagine. Have you detected a change in what people are saying to you in the last month compared to maybe September, October?
Look, I mean, Ilford South is a pretty safe Labour seat, but you had Wes, my colleague, just up the road from me on earlier today. He only won the seat off the Conservatives not too long ago. We've got a number of Conservative-controlled wards in Redbridge, which is the wider borough. And 2 months ago, I'd have been thinking we're still going to have a pretty tough fight. We're going to be fighting for every seat. Right now, I think if the local elections were there, I think we would take seats that we've not taken off the Conservatives for donkey's years, if ever. So, I have a lot of sympathy with that local activist who might come from, polar opposites or political perspectives. But I know how tough it is to go into seats when your party is unpopular. You go into areas that are marginal seats that you're trying to take off your opposition, and it can be pretty thankless. Those Saturday mornings out in the cold and the rain. In this case, I think there would be doors actually being slammed in people's faces. And I think the interesting thing for me is if I was a Conservative MP in one of the red wall seats, so-called red wall seats that were taken off of Labour at the last election, I would be extremely concerned, because without some radical change, and quite quickly, and perhaps, maybe we're still 2 years out from election, that there is time for that to happen. But right now, I would be very, very worried because this stuff has gone down badly. The most dramatic change in any of the polling that's out there that looks at people's voting intentions has been in those red wall seats, with Labour really starting to move forward. A lot of those Tories, I think, will not hold those seats now in the next election, in part because of this, without some dramatic turnaround in the government's fortunes.
Justine Greening, you didn't win your seat without knocking on quite a few doors in Putney back in, 2005. You must have gone through periods where the government had been unpopular and people were slamming doors. I mean, it happens cyclically, I suppose. But do you think that if you were knocking on doors now for the Conservative Party, it would be a bit like after, Black Wednesday in 1992 or the Westland crisis in 1986, or maybe even worse?
I can definitely sympathise. I think anybody who's ever done any canvassing campaigning can sympathise with Sophia in terms of trying to get people on side at a time when the National Party is making it really hard in terms of your party's popularity. I think what's interesting for this year's election is I remember the last local elections I campaigned in, obviously in Wandsworth in 2018, was right in the dog days of that Theresa May government. It was just when it was starting to go really badly wrong. And yet we still hung on to that council. And actually, I think it was much more of an even electoral result, perhaps, than people had expected. I think what that shows, above all, is that people do look at things in the round, and voters are pretty savvy. They absolutely may well have formed a view on whether they think what's happened and what we're debating has been acceptable. They will also, though, look at their local services, whether they think their council's giving them a good deal on council tax, whether the rubbish goes on time. And so I think there will be this broader perspective. And actually, it's going to be a crunch point probably for Boris Johnson's premiership, because actually those elections really will be the time when, rather than debating here, we actually do get to see how people stack this up against the wider delivery, both at a national and local level, of different councils and the government. And so that probably is going to, I think, be the real test. And I think for a lot of Conservative MPs and probably activists, that'll be the moment when they really feel like they're able to say, is this tenable or not in relation to the current setup in number 10?
OK, Ellis.
I'm not going to shirk this question. Sophia asked, what would you say if you were me? Hello, I'm Sophia. I'm canvassing on behalf of the Conservative Party. As you know, we have by-elections due next week. And I know that you've heard a lot of bad things about our leader over the past couple of months, but I'm here to try to allay your fears and assure you that the best man is in charge. This is a man that has steered us through arguably our most difficult crisis since the Second World War. He's been responsible for rolling out this spectacularly successful vaccination program. And we are the first country, it's May now, remember, we are the first country to emerge from the pandemic. COVID is something that we live with now. We're not scared of it. So this man has his faults, but he's guided us stealthily through this crisis. And by the way, you might have heard a lot about these fibs that Johnson tells here and there. Well, how do we know about previous Prime Minister? Boris Johnson lives at a time where social media is rife. People are sending messages, rumours, half-truths, and sometimes downright tittle-tattle, not just to each other, but around the world. How do we know that David Cameron wasn't just as big a liar, or Theresa May? And we know Tony Blair had a good chance of being a bigger liar than any of them. So we don't really know much about our past prime ministers. Boris Johnson, we know an awful lot about him. And one thing I can assure you, he's the best man to lead us in these elections.
And do you think that would work?
No. But it's the best I can do, Ian. And sorry, Sophia, if that's not good enough.
I should point out that they're local elections in May. They're local elections, so I suspect Sophia would be. Where is she from? Fulham. Is that a Conservative council in Fulham, Sophia?
Well, I'm canvassing in areas where we're trying to win Conservative seats at the moment.
Yeah, but if it's a Conservative council, I would say totally ignore Ellis Cashmore's well-meant advice there and say, look at the wonderful council we've got, the fact that we've got lower council tax than the Labour council. I'd concentrate on that and probably not even bring Boris Johnson into the conversation at the moment. Thank you very much indeed. Right, a text question from Diane in Essex. With today's Prince Andrew news, are we seeing the beginning of the end for the royal family? For those who haven't heard the news, the judge in America has thrown out his appeal to have his case thrown out, so he will be facing a civil lawsuit. Sam?
The beginning of the end of the royal family? No, I don't think so. I mean, look, the Queen is very well respected. Look, I'll be honest, I'm a Republican. I would rather have a Democratic elected head of state. But she is very popular. I think I almost feel quite sorry for her. She had a tough year, lost her lifelong partner in Prince Philip. And this is just so awful to see this stuff unfolding, and I think it's going to drag so many more people into it. There are all sorts of people associated with Epstein and with Prince Andrew that could also get pulled into this as well. And it is unprecedented. I mean, certainly in my lifetime, for someone of the royal family to be facing essentially a pretty serious, it's a civil hearing, to potentially have to face, giving sort of answering questions, lawyers under oath about what is a horrendous abuse of people. With Epstein, we'll probably never know what the real truth is of Epstein. He killed himself before that happened. But certainly Ghislaine Maxwell has been convicted in court for some pretty horrendous crimes. So this is awful. Okay. And I think it unfortunately brings great shame on the royal family and our whole country.
Now, we only have 2 or 3 minutes left. So, Ellis, if I can ask you to be relatively brief.
I'd rather be Boris Johnson tonight than Prince Andrew. At least Johnson has some options available to him. Andrew has two. One, he can ignore it, but the case will still proceed by default. Two, and I think that this is his most favourable option, is to try to come to some kind of arrangement, an out-of-court settlement with no admission of culpability on his behalf. I think that's probably the most likely outcome. Or he could fight it, and he could win. But the likelihood is, in the post-Me Too age, he would not be successful.
Justine?
I certainly hope it doesn't damage the royal family, and I don't think it will. I actually think people do distinguish between Prince Andrew compared to the Queen and Prince Charles, and I think that there's a huge amount of respect for the monarchy and the Queen and her public service. I think people are hugely dismayed by what they are seeing happen with Prince Andrew. At the same time, he will clearly have to face justice like everyone else, and that's the right thing. I can't even begin to think what it must be like for the Queen having this happen and play out, but I don't think it will make people feel any less about her. I think there's a huge amount of sympathy for her having lost Prince Philip and then finding her wider family facing some of these issues.
Barbara's tweeted to say, please award Ellis Cashmore a cross-question Oscar. I'm very happy to do that. I don't know if that's within my power. Right, fun text for the end.
And don't believe a word I say.
For the end of the programme. Jack, I've never heard an academic say that before. Jack in
Boris Johnson stuff.
Jack in Dagenham says, studies are suggesting that people spend an average of a third of their waking day on mobile phone apps. Which one do you use too much? Justine.
Oh, God, that's a really good question. Probably BBC Sport, if I'm honest. I go on that a bit too often. It's not Twitter, probably the news apps as well, but news and sports apps. Yes,
that's
there you
not
go.
the most interesting answer you could have given, but we'll forgive you for that.
Is it? Sorry. Sorry about that.
Ellis.
Excluding the porn, obviously.
That's an answer that David Starkey would give.
You can't you can't get enough of material online. This is a moving encyclopedia. People say we spend too much time staring at screens. We don't. We're learning. This is enlightenment when we look at our screens, whether on our phones or our laptops or our tablets or whatever. It's an introduction to a wonder world. So we shouldn't be worried about how much time our kids spend on online or ourselves. So it's like saying, which exercise do you do too much? It's all good for you.
A friend of mine has just texted to say, I expect at least one of them to say grinder. Sam, is that going to be you?
Much to your listeners' disappointment, it's not actually. WhatsApp, probably. I spend far too much time on WhatsApp. It drives my staff crazy, and certainly, lots of MPs communicate on that. I think definitely way too much time on WhatsApp. What I would say, I don't completely agree with Ellis on this one. I think one of the problems that I've certainly personally noticed, and I think it's something that affects many people, concentration span. I do look at all sorts of online social media, news, Twitter. I'm digesting information all of the time. But yeah, I haven't made as much time as I should do to sit down and read a book cover to cover. I think that's a real problem. It definitely affects people's attention spans. And so I think that's something we need to think about as a wider society, because it's actually been shown, I think, in some evidence that's affecting young people and children who are trying to study in terms of their attention span.
They study online.
Okay, I think we got both of that. Thank you very much indeed for coming on, all of you. Ellis Cashmore, Justine Greening and Sam Tarry. If you missed any of tonight's Cross Question, or indeed any throughout the week, you can catch up on the Global Player or indeed wherever you get your podcasts from. In a moment, we're going to continue with your reaction to what happened at lunchtime today. Boris Johnson's apology, his answers at Prime Minister's questions. Where does this all go from here now? You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 9:02.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9:00. Rishi Sunak says the Prime Minister was right to apologise after he admitted he'd attended another gathering during lockdown in May 2020. The Chancellor says he supports Boris